I'm Amira. Welcome to the Politics of Bits. We're joined by Ari Redbord, the global head of policy at TRM Labs, a blockchain intelligence company. Before TRM, Ari had a long and impactful career in the U.S. government, including as a senior advisor working on terrorism and financial intelligence, and as a U.S. attorney. He's one of the world's most thoughtful people on illicit finance and blockchain, and is also one of the most prolific guys on LinkedIn that I know. Ari, thanks for joining us.
Amir, thank you so much for having me. And I will take you everywhere I go with that intro. Most thoughtful people. I thank you. That means a lot coming from you.
Well, so I want to have a really candid conversation with you about the scale of, or just crypto and illicit finance, and how to think about sort of the scale and the scope of the problem. Because I think, oftentimes when we talk about illicit finance and crypto, it's really easy to gloss over the fact that there is illicit finance in crypto, and understanding sort of what is the role that it plays in the ecosystem and how can we best mitigate it, and actually like how big is that role really. I think it's very easy, if you've never spent time in national security, to not really understand, when there's illicit finance, it is a problem to be really concerned about. On the flip side, I think if you're someone who's worked in national security, you're often looking at all of these problems, and they peek out at you, and they're just like roaring heads, and you want to squash them. And so it's very easy to dismiss sort of the benefits of the tool as well. And you're one of the few people I know who has spent significant time in both spaces. And my background is in national security also, which is maybe why this space intrigues me a lot. So I guess it'd be great just to talk about what the issue is. Like, talk us through whether or not illicit finance and crypto is actually an issue, and sort of the machinations of some of the big places that you see the intersection of those things take shape.
Yeah, no, I really love the way you frame the question. And, you and I have had a lot of, conversations around this, and they are always nuanced. And it's important to really kind of dig in outside, past the sound bites that I think are being thrown out a lot when it comes to money laundering in the cryptocurrency space. Look, I think that, first of all, criminal actors, illicit actors are often early adopters of new technology. And they want to take advantage of any type of, of tech or anything else to launder funds and to engage in illicit activity. Overall, at TRM, we put the number of illicit activity within the overall crypto ecosystem at about 0.6%. So under 1% of all activity within the cryptocurrency ecosystem is illicit. So that means that the overwhelming amount of activity is lawful. But what that doesn't mean, and I often hear these stats used to make these arguments, what it doesn't mean is that illicit activity is not a problem and we shouldn't be working to mitigate the risks from illicit actors. For example, over the last 5 years, North Korea has hacked and stolen about $4 billion from the crypto ecosystem. Those funds go towards weapons proliferation and other destabilizing activity. That is a huge issue. And we need to do everything we can. And we can really, we can dig into this, what we can do to mitigate the risk of North Korea not only stealing funds from cryptocurrency exchanges, from DeFi protocols, from bridges, but also how do we potentially track and trace those funds to bring them back. So I think it's really important, like when you're talking about these issues, to say, hey, look, the overwhelming amount of activity within the crypto ecosystem is lawful activity. It is illicit activity is under 1%, but it doesn't mean it's not a problem. And we have to do everything we can to mitigate those risks.
So let's dig into this a little bit more, just to better understand like where the risks are coming from and why they exist. Why does North Korea use crypto for such a significant portion of its budget, or its weapons proliferation budget? Like, why are they so intrigued by this stuff?
Yeah, North Korea is a really interesting place, and there's a lot of great work that's been done at TRM and other places. The Lazarus Heist podcast is a really interesting place to start if you're really trying to dig into kind of the history of this. But North Korea is essentially, less than a banana republic. It has absolutely no economy whatsoever, and would not be a player in the world that we even talk about in the same breath as Russia or China or Iran or some of the other sort of, big kind of rogue regimes in the world. But North Korea has essentially, over the years done anything it can to steal and launder funds. When I was a prosecutor, I had cases involving counterfeit tobacco, counterfeit $100 bills. All the North Korean regime over the years will do anything it can to steal and launder funds. And what they've realized is that if they can build a cadre of hackers, of money launderers on the blockchain, then it can punch way above its weight. So you think about Russian gymnasts in the 80s or something, right? North Korea has built a team of hackers that is often referred to as Lazarus Group in order to target cryptocurrency businesses and then also launder the funds. We've seen huge hacks over the years. The largest, a $625 million hack of the Ronin Bridge, which is part of the play to earn game Axie Infinity. And the scary thing about North Korea, as opposed to just sort of hackers, right as we're doing this podcast, the Bitfinex hackers are being sentenced just a couple blocks from me in U.S. District Court. They have a very different. They're trying to make money, right? They were trying to steal funds and they were trying to make money from those funds. North Korea is different. North Korea is using those funds to prop up the regime, to fund weapons, and really do everything they can because they don't have another source of revenue. So North Korea is really unique, and I think they're in their own bucket to some extent. Other actors have all kinds of different reasons for doing what they do. North Korea is a very, very unique case study, but it's one we have to be really, really careful of. And the last thing I'll kind of say on that is, I often speak, I think even at a hacker house, recently, I said something around, look, I deeply care about national security issues. I know you do too, Amira. I was a national security prosecutor for over a decade. But even if you don't care about these issues and you're in this ecosystem, you're building in this ecosystem, none of this works if ultimately North Korea is able to steal hundreds of millions, billions of dollars from builders in this space, because no one's going to want to put their funds on a bridge in a DeFi protocol, in an exchange, if they think it's going to be hacked and stolen, immediately.
So there's a couple of things here that I want to unpack and maybe take us down a couple of rabbit holes. So I think the first that you pointed out here, which is pretty interesting, and it's a conversation that I think is happening a lot in, I'd say, the defense community. I don't know how much it's trickled over if you're just someone who pays attention to tech, but it's the rise of this idea of asymmetric warfare, right? Like, it used to be that warfare would be determined, in a very crude way. Like, it's you put guns against guns and equipment against equipment. Now it's much easier if you're an actor who has access to, hacking tools, or, basically you find a small exploit, sort of a hole in the armor of your enemy, and you can really dig into it. And it sounds like what you're saying is North Korea is growing expertise at that, right? They've decided that hacking is going to be sort of their form of asymmetric warfare, and they've doubled down on that medium. And that's sort of an interesting revelation that we've seen. And then within that, they've discovered that blockchain is a space where they can really develop expertise. Is that a fair characterization?
It's a totally fair characterization. And I go back to sort of the Russian gymnast analogy, because really what they're doing is identifying STEM, kids at a young age who are very good at science, math, technology. And then as they grow up, they're literally in special schools, having special opportunities, able to travel abroad to different types of competitions and programs, really just constantly building that sort of cyber warrior. And North Korea, and it's not just North Korea, right? Many other countries in the world, Iran and Russia and others, have realized that you could punch way above your weight with a few people if you can engage in cyber warfare. And this cryptocurrency theft that's going on from North Korea is exactly that. It's cyber warfare. And before it was these hacks, it was exploits on Sony and the Bank of Bangladesh. And it wasn't always crypto, but it's always, they have learned that if they can take advantage of new technology, then they can punch way above their weight. And that's what we're seeing here.
So then there's a second distinction I think is really interesting, which is they're hackers, right? They're finding holes in the Ronin Bridge, or basically figuring out ways to fish or otherwise their way into getting a lot of money. What they're not doing, to my knowledge, is running validators and reaping the rewards off of that. And are we seeing, to what extent, when we think about illicit activity in crypto, are we seeing actors use, I would say, the core technology to their benefit, as opposed to seeing something that they can hack specifically? Because I think that's a distinction that's often lost in the conversation about illicit finance and crypto.
I think it's a really important distinction. And I think what we're seeing mostly is the former. That is the sort of trying to take advantage or break into businesses that are building on chain. So whether that's exchanges or DeFi protocols or bridges, infrastructure essentially. We've not necessarily, to the extent that you see Russia starting to lean into mining. Iran has been mining has been a focus for some time. I think you see some of that, but really, certainly when it comes to North Korea, you're seeing targeted attacks, on businesses that exist on chain.
Got it. So you are starting to see a little bit of activity with Russia and maybe Iran, like thinking about using the core technology, but it's pretty limited with respect to sort of the use of illicit finance and crypto.
It's pretty limited, and there's a distinction, I think, between the sort of illicit activity and then some other interesting things that are going on. For example, in the wake of Russia's invasion on Ukraine, we've seen a host of sanctions globally, right, from the U.S., from the EU, from the UK, and those have been targeting, critical infrastructure for Russia. So it's top 10 banks, the central bank, Russia's war machine. So we've seen Russia just say, hey, how can we actually leverage this technology to circumvent this barrage of sanctions? And they've looked to other sanctioned countries. So they say, hey, should we do trade now with Iran in stablecoins? And they've proposed a gold-backed stablecoin to do trade with Iran. We see China selling Russia military equipment with the use of cryptocurrency in order to avoid the U.S. financial system. Now, is this a lot of crypto? No. It's early. But I think what we're seeing more and more is rogue regimes like this start to experiment with crypto. And just to kind of go back to, I think, your original question, which is such a good one, is look, the promise of blockchain technology, the promise of cryptocurrency is cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. We can now send funds in larger amounts faster cross-border than ever before. But bad guys are always going to look to be able to move larger amounts of funds faster across border than ever before. And I think that's the challenge. But we now actually have more visibility on every one of these transactions because they're occurring on public blockchains than we ever did before, which also allows us to investigate, to track and trace, to ultimately disrupt some of this activity. So it's a real paradox, right? Like, people ask me all the time, or say all the time, crypto enables ransomware. Crypto does not enable ransomware. What it does enable is faster, larger payments. But we're also able to track and trace those payments. And we've seen a lot of success from law enforcement tracking and tracing those payments and ultimately seizing them back. And you can only do that when funds are moved in crypto.
So I think that's a great place to sort of look at where we're at today, because we've seen the evolution of a lot of different uses of crypto, both for illicit activity, but then also just like broadly, we've seen an explosion, I think, of use cases of blockchain. And we've had a pretty, I would say, like seismic moment in American politics in the past week or so with the election of former and now future President Trump, and now sort of a Republican sweep of both the House and the Senate. So, no matter what your politics are, the context around a lot of different things is changing, including crypto. And I'm curious, within the context of illicit finance, this is sort of a tricky question, what you might expect to change, or maybe what you're looking out for from the TRM side with respect to uses of crypto for illicit activity. Like, do you think it'll go down? Do you think it'll go up? Like, how are you thinking about what's going to happen in this next sort of chapter?
Yeah, it's amazing moment for us to be recording this. And this is going to be fun for me because I've really only had these conversations internally with TRM folks. I've not had an opportunity to talk about this, publicly. But I think it'll be really interesting, right? Illicit actors use cryptocurrency to raise, to send funds. And I don't know that we're going to see, a significant difference. I think one thing that's really, really important to remember is when we talk about, you mentioned that we have a Republican-controlled Congress. I think conventional wisdom is that we might see some, legislation, potentially market structure legislation in particular around crypto, right? That is, who's going to regulate the space? Is it the CFTC? Is it the SEC? How are they going to divide their authorities What ultimately will a licensing regime look like for cryptocurrency businesses that are operating in the United States? So I think there's a lot of interesting things that are going to happen. And crypto businesses are finally going to get the legal clarity that they've been looking for. But when we have this discussion, and we've been having it for years, I think one thing that is missed is like the one area where we have relative legal clarity today is anti-money laundering. FinCEN for years has said that cryptocurrency businesses, right, virtual asset service providers, exchanges, custodians, brokers, ATMs, they are all money service businesses for purposes of the U.S. anti-money laundering law, which is the Bank Secrecy Act. And they're all required today to have compliance controls in place, to respond to law enforcement subpoenas, to use tools like TRM. So what's interesting is like when we talk about getting legal clarity, and I think we actually are going to get legal clarity, which is really exciting over the course of the next year or so, we actually have legal clarity in this one little piece today. So I think the obligations for cryptocurrency businesses are not going to change dramatically from an anti-money laundering perspective with the sort of new political environment. Then in terms of like your, threat question, right? Where are we, is our focus going to change? I worked in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, and in the Trump administration, and priorities definitely change. I imagine that there will be a lot of continued focus on Iran and how Iran is going to think about sanctions evasion. Potentially less focus on Russia than in this previous administration, just based on statements that President-elect Trump has made over the course of the campaign. What will be the relationship with North Korea? There was some warming of that relationship in the previous Trump administration. We'll kind of see where that goes today. But I think the reality, or let me give you another example. He recently talked about using every tool possible, national security and law enforcement, to go after cartels. Cartels are using cryptocurrency to move funds. We've worked closely with law enforcement to disrupt networks of narcotics trafficking, fentanyl trafficking, et cetera. I'm sure we'll continue that. That'll be either a continued or even sort of growing focus of the next administration. So I think that's all to say that, like, yeah, we might see some policy shift on the margins, but one of the nice things I always remember is Trump and Obama. When I transitioned from the sort of like I was always a career civil servant, but when the administrations changed, I thought to myself, well, this is like the one area these guys agree, right? Like you got to go after bad guys, and when bad guys are using crypto. That's where we're thinking about it all the time. So you may see some shifting on the policy side to some extent, but I think that, stopping illicit activity is always going to be a priority for any administration, law enforcement, national security type issues.
I think that's helpful framing. Can I poke you on something a little bit? So,
Definitely.
You said we have a lot of the existing tools that we need. We don't need additional regulation when it comes to AML and crypto. So why is it still a problem? Like, why are we still seeing that 0.6% of illicit activity or 0.6% of crypto activity going into illicit activity? Like, where are the holes?
Yeah, I'll get to the holes in a moment, but I will definitely say from a high level perspective, it's like that's probably about a healthy amount of illicit finance in any financial system, right? Like, I would not want to be engaging in a financial system that didn't have any illicit activity, because that means it's just not very successful, right? Bad guys are going to gravitate to where the money is, and when things are working, you're going to have some illicit activity. I'm always really reticent to even repeat these types of numbers, but usually people put about 3 to 5% for the traditional financial system as illicit activity. I'm putting crypto as under 1%, so we're talking significantly less than in the overall ecosystem. So I'd say that's probably like a healthy amount of illicit activity, as much as I hate to say that. But
sorry, do you think it's less because criminals know that they'll get caught using crypto? Like, why do you think it's lower than the overall amount of illicit activity?
I think it's a mix. I think we've had a lot of success over the last few years showing illicit actors, or sort of making that statement, planting that flag that, hey, this is not anonymous. We can actually track you more effectively. I think it's also it's growing, and we have not necessarily gotten to like true mainstream adoption yet, and maybe those numbers will go up. But what will also go up is the amount of volume. So, hopefully that number will still hover around. Like, even as we've seen the ecosystem grow, the number has still hovered around less than 1% over the last, couple of years. All of that said, there are some real existential threats to the ecosystem. One of those is North Korea, as I mentioned. Another is scams and fraud. We have seen a proliferation of scams in crypto, and every time the price of Bitcoin goes up, I mean, we are to the moon this week. We see a proliferation of scams, and it's funny. I know everyone else is celebrating this, and they should be, but my head always turns to, oh God, Bitcoin's at 90,000. We're going to see the scammers are going to be running wild, and they really have been. We've seen like a proliferation of scams over the course of the last few weeks. We put the number at about 12 billion last year in scams and fraud in the crypto ecosystem. I mean, that's a really, really high number. And I think a lot of people are very afraid to engage with crypto because they're worried about scams out there. There's a lot of conversation about pig butchering, which is this usually a crypto related scam where, a romance scam or something where someone builds up a relationship, eventually getting them to send money, maybe investing in a fake crypto project, and then ultimately steals those funds. We've seen more and more of those, and we're not going to trace our way out of those. We do a lot of these cases. We work closely with law enforcement on them, but ultimately it's going to be about educating folks that they need to be, really, really cognizant, really, really vigilant about who they're engaging with online. So I throw that one out as an example. It's like, yes, we need to do everything we can to mitigate these risks. Part of it is education. Part is like having the tools like TRM and the training necessary to use them. But then a lot of it is also like, hey, there is a number that's going to have to be like acceptable because, I talk a lot about we're not going to. Our goal is not to stop financial crime. We've never stopped financial crime. The goal should be to mitigate the risk of financial crime as much as possible.
So, Ari, I guess my question here is that I've met with a lot of legislators who hear that approach and they're like, yeah, we'll never stop it. That doesn't mean we don't try, right? Like we'll never stop crime overall, but that doesn't mean we don't try. We don't try to innovate in our laws. And, I think famously there was a bill that was released maybe last year, 2 years ago, from Senator Warren and Republican counterpart, focused on a number of provisos to help curb illicit, or ideally to help curb illicit activity in crypto. And one of the things that they would do is require sort of KYCing of validators. And so, I think it'd be great to talk through maybe that particular approach. And then maybe some other sort of legislative approaches that you think might be more interesting or viable or worth investigating. What do we do about this?
Yeah. Gosh, there's a lot to unpack there. So I guess to go to sort of like the proposal in terms of regulating the technology, which is really what this is. Look, my view is that there are technology solutions to all of this. And that's what's so cool about the space, right? We can leverage blockchain technology to actually do compliance and financial crime compliance better than we ever have before. And I mentioned this sort of the characteristic of public blockchains, right? They're traceable, they're trackable, they're immutable. They're virtual crime scenes. I mean, we can now go back and look on the blockchain for breadcrumbs from years past in order to investigate a case today. I mentioned again the Bitfinex hackers, the Razzle Khan case. They're being sentenced this week in DC. And that was a 2016 hack of the Bitfinex exchange. But ultimately, investigators were able to go back with better tools 5 years later, and were ultimately able to follow the money associated with these two individuals, arrest them in New York, and make the biggest seizure of anything in U.S. history, $3.6 billion at the time. Amazingly, in total, they're going to forfeit this week close to $10 billion in the case, just based on the price of Bitcoin this week as well. So it's extraordinary, but that is investigators, great investigators like Christian Chesky, who's at TRM. He led that case when he was at IRSCI. That's a case of great investigators leveraging the technology. And it's not just for investigations, it's for compliance. We work today with the leading DeFi protocols. We are doing sanction screening and anti-money laundering on their front ends. And the retort to that is, well, North Korea or terrorist financier can go around TRM to the protocol. And that's exactly right and absolutely true. But what I see every day, I've been actually on I've been on, in these conversations with you and others, we have folks who are building digital ID, who are using zero knowledge proofs in order to do compliance at the protocol layer. So I think that there are ultimately going to be technology solutions where we don't need to put really impossible burdens on validators, on certain DeFi projects, in order to do compliance, the best we possibly can. So I think we can leverage the technology, and I think that gets a long way to solving a lot of these issues. When I was a prosecutor, I was investigating cases involving bulk cash smuggling and networks of hawalas and shell companies and high value art and diamonds and real estate, right? There was no TRM to track and trace those things. Those cases were hard. With crypto, you are able to, in real time, track and trace the flow of funds in order to potentially follow those funds and seize them back.
Yeah. So what you're saying, if I parse it as Amira, like the solution to maybe an increase in crime isn't necessarily to change the law. It's to invest in better crime fighting activity. It's to hire more police, hire better, like get better technology, better be able to surveil the landscape so that you can track down the bad actors.
I think it's to build an investigative workforce for the digital age, in large part. Over the last few years, we've seen really DOJ do this interesting pivot from this kind of post 9/11 world where we were all living in trying to stop a terror attack, which still very real, but into kind of the digital space. I think that the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in 2021 had a lot to do with that. It brought ransomware and these types of crypto payments to the mainstream. So over the course of the last couple of years, we saw a national cryptocurrency enforcement team stood up at DOJ, which is part of the computer crimes section. We have seen the National Security Division within the Department of Justice set up a NatSec cyber team to just focus on these types of issues. I think we're seeing modernizing when it comes to federal law enforcement. I mean, the FBI, HSI, DEA, Secret Service, IRSCI, all have squads who are dedicated solely to cyber and crypto related cases. I think we're going to see that continued modernization to state and local police forces. I think it's going to take a lot longer just based on resources. But I do think that, yes, dedicating resources to law enforcement to be able to better investigate these types of cases, I think is absolutely essential here. And when we're talking about law, what can we do from a legal perspective, from a legislative perspective? It is about closing gaps. There are certainly gaps. I mentioned, that the large exchanges, Coinbase, Binance, Gemini, Kraken, I mean, they have great compliance controls in place. They have compliance teams. They use TRM. But, there are Russia-based exchanges like ChatX and Garantex and Bitslato and Suex, all sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, but they don't have compliance controls, right? They're not implementing the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF standards for anti-money laundering. So there are always going to be gaps. A lot of them are going to be in those rogue jurisdictions, but we have to do everything we can to close the gaps, and then really make sure that we have the tools and the training that we need to go after bad guys.
Yeah. So the issue is basically we have the requirements that we need today, at least in the U.S., right? So we have all these requirements by the Bank Secrecy Act that exchanges that are based in the U.S. are forced to comply with and do comply with. However, there are exchanges overseas that do not comply, and presumably there are off-ramps overseas that don't comply. And the fact of the matter is you can do everything you can to try to get them to bring into compliance, but they're never going to be there. So let's make sure that actors inside the United States are complying. And also let's invest in resources to make sure that we can track people who escape the U.S. jurisdiction or flow and are able to track them down.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And, one thing to go back to your kind of question about the election and sort of the changing landscape, I'm hopeful that with that type of clear market structure legislation, with stablecoin legislation, people are going to want to build here in a way that they maybe haven't over the last few years. And the more people building in the U.S. and coming within the U.S. regulatory perimeter is only going to help kind of anti-money laundering efforts, right? They're all going to be under the Bank Secrecy Act. They're all going to be compliant with U.S. regulation. They're all going to file reports with FinCEN, the Financial Intelligence Unit for the United States government, part of the Treasury Department. So I think that more companies coming within the regulatory perimeter, building in the US is only good in order to mitigate these risks.
Ari, I'm curious with the election, have you gotten any sort of interesting phone calls or inflow? Like, has there been sort of surprising interest in TRM that has picked up in the last week or so, related to the stuff we're talking about here? Like, what's been fascinating to track since the results have come through?
Wow. Yeah, honestly, I think things are so crazy that it's trying to just keep up with kind of everything that's going on. I mean, I have never seen more excitement or interest around cabinet picks. It feels like the NFL draft. Like, I feel like they should do this in Madison Square Garden or something where they say, and now for Secretary of State. It's like, so I think a lot of the focus from everyone has been on, all right, well, who's going to be in these roles, and what is their background, how they're going to implement whatever the president's policies over the course of the next 4+ years. One thing I will say is that, like, I think that there's a real interest in technology right now. You see Elon Musk now charged with this sort of Office of Government Efficiency, the Department of Government Efficiency. And, I know a lot of it feels like, Doge and all the sort of pop culture piece. But in reality, I think a lot of it is like, hey, how can we use technology to build a leaner, meaner government? And obviously, like, TRM solutions are very much a part of that conversation, right? We are leveraging technology in order to do investigations in ways that they have never been done before. So I'd say that, like, right now, one thing I'm certainly seeing is like, hey, how can we use technology? How can these agencies use technology to do better investigations, to do all that stuff? And we're obviously very much at the center of those conversations.
Maybe to close out, you can take us into the room as someone who's been in one of these agencies, sitting in Treasury, for example, when a turn of administration happens. What's it actually like to be the civil servant who's kind of waiting for one set of political appointees to leave and the other to come in? Like, how are you thinking about that process, and what does it actually look like when you're that person who's at the desk with like a boss swapping out?
Yeah, no, I love that question. It's interesting. I had the really good fortune of working for 4 or 5 really excellent U.S. attorneys when I was in AUSA in DC, and very, very little changed in those roles. All administrations, and I think I mentioned this earlier, sort of have generally agreed with the type of work that I've done over the years, right? You're prosecuting bad guys, whether they're terrorist financiers or sanctions evaders or export control cases, national security cases. Sort of things change on the sort of policy pieces, right? Are we going to focus more on Venezuela? Are we going to focus more on Russia, more on Iran, North Korea? But usually it's sort of generally the same. I think it's true. It was true at Treasury as well. A little less so because you really are at sort of the mothership. You are sitting right down the hall from the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, from the Deputy Secretary, from the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. So I do think that what you start to see is like, hey, and you start to speculate, right? Like, it's just human nature. Hey, how is my job going to change when this person comes in? I think, and I could be wrong this time around, that things change a lot less than folks think. We have a really incredible group of true subject matter experts certainly within the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice, who know these issues really better than anyone. As an example, in the last administration, or I shouldn't say that, when the transition between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, look, the same people that implemented the JCPOA, the nuclear deal on Iran, were the same people who unwound the nuclear deal. And that was just an example of changed policies from administration. And I think what career civil servants are great at is providing the guidance, providing the expertise and the knowledge in order to implement the administration's policies. Because, elections have consequences. And those consequences are usually like, hey, there's going to be different policies. But great civil servants, subject matter experts, I think are folks we should look to for advice and guidance as we try to implement those policies.
I think it's a really amazing point, which is like the people who are civil servants who kind of hang out for years and build up expertise are, in my mind, heroes, right? They stick around, like administrations come and go, and they just stick it out, and they're there to serve, and often don't get the recognition
I will
that they
tell you,
need.
you don't do it for the money. So, like, I mean,
Yeah.
it is, it's just a really important point, and I will say till I'm blue in the face that there's so much expertise on these issues in the U.S. federal government, at FinCEN, at OFAC, at the Department of Justice, at the sort of TFFC, which is the policy shop within Treasury. There's so much expertise in these places, and I hope incoming political appointees really lean on that expertise. That's what I've always seen. That's what I saw in the Obama administration. That's what I saw in the first Trump administration, and I'm really hopeful that that'll continue.
Can you help me settle something? I think that there's a lot of a strong sense that the apparatus within somewhere like Treasury or DOJ is very reactive, right? I think a lot of times one of the conversations that frustrates me on crypto Twitter is people saying, this person got arrested because the election turned out a certain way, or because they decided to do something that made this person look bad. Um, I what I think is oftentimes when someone is being arrested or a case is brought against someone, that has been something that's been in the making for months and months and months, not often years. Um, but I also haven't been in the system for a long time. And so I'm curious, how reactive when you're thinking about, um, a new enforcement action or, putting together a new set of guidelines, like whatever it is, like how reactive are you to the current moment? And how much of that stuff is just things that have been built for a long time and like the timing just lines up whenever something hits the news?
It's almost never reactive in the way that, I think you nailed it. You answered the question in large part. And I've been seeing this on crypto Twitter and elsewhere as well. I think the reality is we give the government way too much credit. These cases take so much time and people are working so hard for so long. And it's very, very rare that there's like a political moment and then that ultimately leads to certainly a criminal case. Look, assistant United States attorneys, trial attorneys within the Department of Justice, these are career civil servants who aren't trying to win or lose who are not trying to win cases. They're trying to do justice. And I can't imagine a world where you have federal prosecutors doing anything for purely political reasons. They're they're investigating and then ultimately bringing charges where, they went to a grand jury, the grand jury voted, and they have an indictment. So I don't think this is happening. If there's anything that I like want to make sure never happens is that we never weaponize our Department of Justice, in this way against political opponents or that sort of thing. So, but I've certainly never seen it in my career, and I hope to never see it.
Let's take the case of Tornado Cash, for example. I think there's a lot of people in crypto that sort of have seen the evolution of the sanctioning of Tornado Cash, the arrest of some of the protocol builders, and they say like this looks like targeting, like this is not fair. And I'm curious, when you look at that case as someone who's been a U.S. attorney and also sat within the Treasury Department and worked on terrorism finance, what do you see? Like, what is the lens that you see on the evolution of that kind of case that people from the outside aren't seeing?
I love you because you only ask the easy questions, Amira. This is a really tough one, and I'm probably not going to provide a purely like a totally satisfying answer. But I think what Tornado Cash started, and we've seen a number of other cases since, start really like a global conversation on privacy and security for the digital age. I think, on the one hand, we have to figure out how to allow lawful users to use privacy enhancing technologies in a open financial system, right? Where like I've been saying this the whole last 30 minutes with you, where every transaction is traceable and immutable. Like people need privacy. They need privacy to transact. They need use of mixers. They need use of privacy coins. But at the same time, there is no world where we, as the U.S. government or foreign partners, can allow North Korea to launder billions of dollars through any kind of service. Whether it's a centralized mixing service or a decentralized mixing service, it's just not going to be okay. So I think the challenge really becomes is how do you thread that needle? And the reason this isn't going to be a satisfying answer is because on the one hand, I do believe that we can use technology in order to thread that needle, right? I kind of described the way we can do compliance today for DeFi and how we're only going to get better at it. But the other piece to this is I don't know what the evidence is in the Tornado Cash case. I really have been waiting to see how the evidence plays out, because I think the evidence in that case is going to be really, really important. It is going to be, hey, was this just in fact a developer who put a smart contract out on a blockchain and let it go? Or did these developers have more control over the protocol than we would think? Did they make decisions around allowing or not allowing certain types of illicit activity on their platforms? Did they put anything in place to stop illicit activity on their platforms? So there's going to be, I think, there's going to be a lot of discussion, but I think what's really important when you talk about specific cases is for us to look at the evidence on a case-by-case basis. And I think it's going to be really interesting how it plays out in Tornado Cash. And I would say this about another case, like, hey, if there's a new case that comes out about mixers or about an anonymity enhanced coin, what are the facts? How much control did that developer retain, on that protocol? And I do think it's really important. I don't think just the fact that we're talking about software developers means that automatically they have, they can't be prosecuted criminally for the activity that occurs on those platforms. I think it depends how involved they were in the illicit activity that was occurring on those platforms.
I would love for you to just comment on this moment that we're in, both politically, but then also in terms of the crypto cycle.
Yeah, look, I'm super excited. And I know that folks like, Ari, you're excited all the time. And I am, because it's really cool to
You
work
are
on
excited all the time.
I am excited all
That's
the time. But I am particularly excited because, working in this space, in this moment, I mean, I know, Amira, you're having this experience too. It's like, not only is the price of Bitcoin sort of at all-time highs, and I've always sort of said that that's really not indicative of anything, but we're also seeing the technology used in really meaningful ways. I was at Money 2020 in Las Vegas a few weeks ago, and all the talk was around stablecoins as for payments at scale. Circle, Ripple, PayPal, Stripe had just bought Bridge to build out stablecoin infrastructure. I feel like we're starting to see this thing happen that we've been speculating about over the last few years. So then you have the building and like the excitement, whether it's Bitcoin or stable coins. And then all of a sudden you have this political moment, which, we'll see. Look, promises in the campaign trail are not policy, and we'll ultimately see how that plays out. But I think we can be pretty bullish on the possibility of actually sound regulation, legislation over the course of the next year or so, which will hopefully encourage even more building in the United States. We've lived through the last few years of all the talk around the work that's being done in the UAE and the work that's being done in Singapore and Japan and MiCA, the market in crypto assets legislation. Well, I'm kind of excited to have the U.S. moment. And I think that it is, as much as I love all my friends in the EU, I'm excited to have the moment here, and I'm excited to see people build here. So, yes, Amira, I am always excited, but I am particularly excited right now, and just so cool to record this with you in this moment.
I am so excited for the U.S. moment as well. Ari, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.